Welcome to discussion 4A, the Constitution and Congress. These are our topics for today. What are the major constitutional differences between the House and the Senate? What role does population and the census play in the United States House of Representatives? And what are the constitutional powers of Congress? So let's get started with what the Constitution says about the House and the Senate. And we know that this comes from Article 1 of the Constitution. Article 1 addresses the legislative branch. The role of the legislative branch is to make law and policy. The executive branch and the judicial branch have changed the relationship over time of how this process plays out. But individual members in the House and the Senate have also gained power over time. So let's look at Article 1. Section 1 of Article 1 created a bicameral legislature. That means two houses. So we have the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. The U.S. Congress is bicameral. Most states in the country are also bicameral in their state governments. Nebraska is the only exception. So in Richmond, Virginia has a bicameral state government as well. We have two houses in our state government. Now let's look at the Senate, some of the constitutional issues addressed in Section 3 for the United States Senate. Each state gets two senators. It's based on equal representation. Originally, the United States senators were elected by members of the state legislature, but the 17th Amendment changed that and made United States senators directly elected by the people of the state. Senators serve 6-year terms, and 1/3 of the Senate, so that's 1/3 of 100, are up for re-election every 2 years. So the terms are staggered. There won't be a time when all 100 senators have to be re-elected or face a re-election campaign in the same year. And the constitutional requirements for eligibility: a senator must be at least 30 years old, have resided in the U.S. for at least 9 years, and must be a legal resident of the state that he or she is representing. The Senate is also considered the more esteemed body, the upper body of the two houses in Congress. Now, Article 1, Section 2 addresses the House, and the number of representatives that each state has in the House is based on the state's population. Members of the House are directly elected by the people, and they were originally in the Constitution. The whole House is up for re-election every 2 years, so a term for a member of the United States House of Representatives is 2 years, and the constitutional requirements for eligibility are that a member of the House be at least 25 years old, have resided in the United States for at least 7 years, and must be a legal resident of the state that he or she is representing. The representative doesn't have to live in the district they represent, but they do have to be a legal resident of their state. And it is the chamber out of the two that is closer to the people, because they get reelected more often and they represent less people in most cases. Now here's a map showing you all 435 congressional districts across the country. The red and the blue symbolize which party controlled that seat at the time this map was made. There's nothing in the Constitution that specifies there be 435 congressional districts. That number was set by law in 1929. It's called the Reapportionment Act of 1929. So maybe the number 435 will change if Congress ever changes the law. Originally, when the Constitution was ratified, there were 65 members of the House, but now there's 435. Now let's take a little tour and see if we can look at the Capitol building. So this is on the east end of the National Mall. This is the United States Capitol building. The United States Senate is located in this chamber, and the United States House of Representatives is located in the southern chamber of the Capitol. And the buildings on the sides are office buildings for members of both houses. And as we move west along the National Mall, you can see some of the Smithsonian museums. We will come to the Washington Monument. The White House is just to the north of the Washington Monument. There's the White House. We saw K Street in a previous discussion for lobbying. The Lincoln Memorial is right here. And as you cross the river, you will come to Arlington National Cemetery. And Arlington National Cemetery houses JFK's grave. And it was put in that spot. It's right here, the Eternal Flame. It was put in that spot on purpose so it lines up. It makes a straight line with the Lincoln Memorial. The census plays a huge role in the makeup of the House. So the enumeration of the people happens every 10 years. The counting of the people happens every 10 years. That's specified in Section 2 of Article 1. So like I mentioned a second ago, originally there were 65 members of the House, or one member for every 30,000 people. Now, the population of the United States is approximately 320 million, so that makes one representative for every 750,000 people. And that number is set at 435 by law. So each state gets its share of representatives based on its population. And that makes the changing of the numbers of representatives per state a very important part of how the House is made up. Apportionment is allotting congressional seats to each state following the decennial census. So whenever the census happens, if a state has gained population or lost population, that would influence the number of seats that that state has in the House of Representatives. And we know that redistricting is the redrawing of congressional districts to reflect an increase or decrease in the seats allotted to states. And it also reflects population shifts within a state. And we know that gerrymandering is the term for redistricting that happens for political purposes, when the districts are redrawn for one party's political advantage. And we've just heard that a federal appeals court has ordered that Virginia use new maps for some of its congressional districts. There's a couple terms that apply to some of these congressional districts. Now, there's not many marginal districts across the country anymore. So the process of redistricting, which is carried out in the state legislatures, has led to a dearth of marginal districts. A marginal district is a congressional district in this case, where seats are competitive. There's not certainty about which party or which candidate is going to win the seat before the election takes place. They're swing seats. So the winner in a marginal district receives a majority, but that number is less than 55% of the vote. Few seats in our United States Congress are marginal districts anymore. Most are what we call safe seats because of the advantage of being an incumbent. It makes it increasingly difficult to defeat a sitting member of Congress. There are also districts that are called majority-minority districts. This is a district in which a minority group or groups, a group that's traditionally referred to as minority populations, comprise a majority of the district's population. In 2013, there were 113 congressional majority-minority districts. They do not violate the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Supreme Court has held that legislatures can draw majority-minority districts that follow traditional non-racial considerations like geographic compactness and keeping communities of interest together. So here is key question number 3. What are the constitutional powers of Congress? And the main idea is that both houses share the authority to make law. That's what the legislative branch does. It makes law. And there are things that both houses do together, like declaring war, raising an army or a navy, coining money, regulating commerce, establishing the federal courts, immigration and naturalization, which means the meaning and the application of what naturalization is can change depending on Congress, and sometimes can be a political term. So naturalization, which comes from the Naturalization Clause of the Constitution, says that Congress can establish a uniform rule of naturalization. So the term naturalization is the process by which citizenship is granted to a foreign citizen or national after he or she fulfills the requirements established by Congress in the Immigration and Nationality Act. That is a major power of Congress to control naturalization. Article 1, Section 8 also addresses the necessary and proper clause. This is a huge clause in the Constitution. This has allowed Congress to increase its authority, maybe beyond the scope of what the framers have had in mind, but the text of necessary and proper says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So the enumerated powers. And we know that one of the early court cases, McCulloch v. Maryland, ruled that establishing a national bank, chartering a national bank, was necessary and proper to carrying out the enumerated power of regulating commerce. Another big provision of the Constitution is the origination clause. All revenue bills must originate in the House. Although this has been blurred throughout the years, both chambers will work on bills at the same time in some cases. So here's a couple of terms that will hopefully clarify what revenue and appropriations are. Revenue bills raise money and appropriation bills spend money. And like we say, both are by tradition and by virtue of the origination clause supposed to begin in the House, which is closer to the people. But the line has been blurred in that regard throughout the years. So appropriations bills are the provision of funds through these annual appropriation bills that we'll learn more about when we get to the budget for federal agencies to make payments out of the Treasury for specified purposes. And while we're on the topic, a bill is a proposed law. And in order for that bill to become law, it has to go through a formal process. But the bill is the proposed law. Sometimes with appropriations bills, there's something that gets added called a rider. And appropriation bills are often what's considered must-pass. They must get passed because if they don't get passed, then a government agency would run out of money. So because appropriation bills are often must pass, sometimes members of Congress will stick a rider onto that appropriation bill. And a rider is called a rider because it rides along the appropriation bill, the must-pass nature of the appropriation bill, to make the rider become law. It takes advantage of the fact that appropriation bills are essential. It is a non-germane amendment, which non-germane just means it's not related to the actual appropriation, so it's off topic. It doesn't have to do with the actual appropriation bill that it's getting added to. It changes the permanent law related to a government program that gets covered by that appropriation bill. So it's a way to sneak in something that's not related to an appropriation bill on a must-pass appropriation bill. And we'll look at some examples in class of riders. Here's one from NPR talking about a couple of riders that were added to potential gun control legislation in the aftermath of Sandy Hook Elementary School. So here's where it mentions riders. we know that the House of Representatives, if we're continuing with the constitutional powers of Congress, the House has the power to impeach with a simple majority, to charge, and that's what impeach means. Impeach just means to charge, to indict the president, the vice president, or other civil officers, like federal judges, with treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So the federal official would be charged in the House, they would be impeached in the House with a simple majority vote, and then the trial for that impeachment would happen in the Senate. The Senate conducts the trial of impeachment where a 2/3 vote is necessary to remove the official from office. And even if the official is removed from office, they're found guilty in their impeachment trial, they could still face legal action outside of what happened in the impeachment trial. They could still go to jail, essentially. Congress also has the power to declare war. This is known as the Declaration of War Clause in Article 1, Section 8. Congress formally declares war, but the last time this happened was World War II. And the Constitution seems to set up a conflict between the legislative branch and the executive, the president, because the president is commander-in-chief. And that brings up an interesting question of what actually constitutes a declaration of war, a formal declaration of war. Was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution a formal declaration of war that authorized American military involvement in Vietnam? Congress has been using something more recently called an authorization for use of military force, where the president is authorized to use military force, but it's not a formal declaration of war in the eyes of Congress. So there seems to be some disagreement about how Congress should involve itself in the use of military force. The Senate has the job to approve presidential appointments, things like judges, ambassadors, cabinet and sub-cabinet positions, with a simple majority vote. And this comes from the Appointments Clause of Article 2. The President shall nominate, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint, and then people who to fill certain positions. And it is just a simple majority vote. So if the President would like to appoint a federal judge to the district courts, to the Circuit Court of Appeals, or to the Supreme Court, the Senate would have to vote. And if a simple majority of senators vote to confirm the judge, then they would become the judge. The Senate also approves all presidential treaties with a 2/3 vote. And that means that sometimes there's been some failures where presidents have worked to negotiate a treaty, but then the Senate does not ratify that treaty. And a famous example is Woodrow Wilson never had the Treaty of Versailles approved by the Senate after World War I. And that comes from the Treaty Clause of Article 2. He, the President, shall have power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. Alright, that takes us to the end of our look at the Constitution and Congress. There's some awesome things in there. Hope it helped. Let me know at the link below if you have any questions or anything that needs more clarification, and we will address it. Good luck studying!